Part of my wanting to be on this river is to get away from the world and yet be in it at the same time.
How long are you going to be in the canoe?
Until I get to New Orleans.
When you told me about your project, and I was thinking about you, I said, Eddie is out of his damn mind.
You got more guts than me.
Why do you say that?
Ain't no way I'm gonna be on something that ain't got a motor on it. Just if one of these barges come by here kicking their wake up, you going under.
I mean, I look at it right now and see how fast it's flowing. You'd better respect that river.
Being down here in the South, you got people that's still living in the old days.
We have problems in race relations and politics big time.
The subtext question is, whose river is this? And if it is ours, then it's mine. And if it's mine, then I can do this thing.
This river is an economic artery for the whole country.
It's the breadbasket of America and the world, really.
If it weren't for the river, I would not be here.
Sometimes we take it for granted because it's here. It's always here, it's always going to be here. And that's not the case.
Ultimately, everything that is trapped upstream will break loose. It will cause destruction at an unfathomable scale to us.
We have to recognize that this river, this land, this country belongs to us too.
The longer this goes on, the more we realize that there just aren't that many differences between us.
The river has changed. America has changed. This river now is my river. Good afternoon. I'm happy to be here. I almost wasn't because I had to go to the dentist. If anybody has read Mississippi Solo, she will remember an episode where I had a little accident that caused some damage to a tooth. And every once in a while, that tooth gives me a little problem and I have to make a visit to the dentist. I don't know exactly what else to talk about except my tooth and that first river trip. But it's the river is important to me and always has been. And it's interesting listening to the previous group talking about the various museums along the River Road. I did not realize how important the River Road was to me as a kid. People ask me all the time, why did I decide to canoe down the Mississippi River? And the answers are multiple, part of which is to change my life, a kind of passive suicide, wanting to see who I was from the inside out, wanting to discover America in a certain sense as well. I grew up in St. Louis. I grew up near the river. I went down to the river almost every day as a really young boy because my parents had only one car and my mother drove my father to work downtown. And I spent a lot of time going by the river, and when she would stop and go look at the river or look at the arch as it was being built, I developed this connection to the river. So when it was time for me to start thinking about doing something to change my life, canoeing the Mississippi River, even though I had absolutely no canoeing experience, canoeing the Mississippi River became an easy thing for me to latch on to. But now as I look back, thinking about not just that trip down the river, but also my early connections to the river, I remember how many times I went up and down the River Road going to places like Pere Marquette State Park, which is actually on the Illinois River, but still you'd ride the River Road to go up to it. And the number of times that I drove down to New Orleans and the number of times I drove up to St. Paul. So the River Road itself becomes really important to how I developed as not just a writer and not just as an adventurer, but as a person. the river itself have both helped me to develop who I am as a writer, but also gave me another look at the secret cave of what it means to be American. And what I mean by that is, in partly we are, especially in this political moment that we're living, we are really divided into a kind of group think, where we as Democrats think this way, we as Republicans think that way, and we as somebody else think a different way. We racialize everything. You can't read Huckleberry Finn because of what Mark Twain says about Jim. There are all kinds of crazinesses that happen in the group world in which we live, the multiple group worlds in which we live. I try to get out of those groups, whatever groups I may ostensibly belong to. I would like to get out of those groups every once in a while and touch other people. The beauty of my river trip, the first one and the second one, part of which gave me a sense of myself, the first one. The second one gave me a sense of myself in a completely different context 30 years later. And that context is non-racial. It's racial because you're on this river, and as my uncle said in Mississippi Solo, you're going from someplace where there aren't many black people down to where they still don't like us much, which may or may not be true in both of those cases. But the racial context is there regardless of the reality of his cliche. So a black man alone in a canoe is experiencing that river probably differently than a non-black person in that same canoe. But what I discover as I'm canoeing down the Mississippi River is, on an individual basis, first trip, second trip, except for a couple of events, both of those two trips illuminated an aspect of America that we just don't get to see. And part of the reason we don't get to see it is we don't look for it. And part of the reason we don't look for it is that we are in this group think all the time. And I am convinced that on an individual basis, when you meet person A or person B, you bring something to that encounter. That person brings something to the encounter. And more times than not, there is some kind of resonance. That is the resonance that I was looking for as I went down the river the second time. The first time was just an adventure for a crazy person who had nothing to do for a few months and decided to take a canoe down the river. The second time, and maybe the third time when I'm 90 years old, I will have a different reason for going down the river. But the river gives me something, and it always has. And it isn't just a sense of who I am. It also gives me a sense of nature. I'm a city kid. I grew up in St. Louis. I can't tell one tree from another. This tree is a tree, and that tree is a tree too. The only thing I can tell about these two different trees is one loses its leaves in the fall, and the other one does not. I don't know plants. I hardly know animals. I can't tell a bird call from a dog whistle. But when I'm on the river, my senses are completely altered. I am much more in tune to nature, much more in tune to the rhythms of nature, the rhythms of the day. And bizarrely, I think COVID is a wonderful opportunity for people to discover the river. Now that may sound a little strange. COVID has kept us locked in the house for these last months. Wouldn't it be great to get in a canoe and go out onto the river? Talk about social distancing. We are way socially distanced when we're on the river. There's nobody else around until you come to a place where other people have been or will be or are hanging out. But otherwise, you're on the river and you're communing with nature, you're communing with the river, you're communing with yourself. And COVID gives us a chance to get out of our normal lives a little bit, which is hard to do under normal circumstances, to get out of our lives and go do something crazy, like just being on the river. And it doesn't really have to be canoeing down the Mississippi River. It can just be sitting by the river, but it's an opportunity to get out of the house and do something in the natural world. That clip that we just watched is a clip from the movie I made, the documentary film I made of the second canoe journey. There is a scene in the movie, but also in that little clip where I'm about to paddle with a bunch of kids. It is one of the best memories I have of being on the river. It is also very important because what happens in that scene is a transmission from an old guy to young people about the importance of the river. And not just as a natural resource, but as a piece of ownership. I think one of the problems we're having in this political moment is we don't recognize just how much this country is ours. The more we recognize ownership in this place, I say in this place even though I'm not in that place at the moment, but the more we recognize ownership in the country, the more we will take care of it, the more we will feel invested in what's happened and what is going to happen, and the more we will want to protect the bounty that we have already. It's rather amazing how easily we can divest ourselves of that kind of ownership and let things just happen. I give an example of one guy in a trading post, the Black Hawk Trading Post, just south of La Crosse, Wisconsin. I pull in one morning in my canoe and it's freezing cold outside, so I go into the trading post just to get a cup of coffee, which turns into another cup of coffee and another cup of coffee, just to get warm and stay warm as long as I can before I have to get back out into the boat. Some guy comes in to buy whatever supplies he's buying. We have a little chat. He says, "Who's the crazy person in the canoe outside?" And of course it's me. After we chat for a bit, he leaves and I'm still in the place drinking coffee. 20 minutes or so later, he comes back. Only now, because it's cold outside, he's got a stack of warm clothes to give to me. Not that I need the warm clothes, and I tell him explicitly, no, I've got plenty of gear in my canoe. What he saw was an individual in need, and the need was something he could satisfy. He took it upon himself to go home, find a pile of clean, warm clothes, and bring them back to me, which I think is just an amazing gesture. But it's an amazing gesture not only because of the generosity, but because of what he had to go through to do it, and also it shows initiative. I think if we take the initiative to do things like that for one another, whatever the context, we can make this place a much better place. When we show that kind of solidarity, it gives not just that sense of ownership, but a sense of camaraderie to the ownership, that we're all in this canoe basically together. Now I'm talking to you from France, and Mississippi Solo has just come out in French for the first time 30 years later. And I'm getting a lot of attention because of that book. But a lot of the attention comes from the Mississippi River itself, because Europeans, especially the French, are wild about the Mississippi River. The minute you say Mississippi River, everybody's antenna go up. Everybody knows what you're talking about. Everybody thinks, ooh, wow, that's some place in America that I would like to see. I don't know anybody who is not moved by the Mississippi River. But there's another effect, I think, of Mississippi Solo coming out right now, and that is the things that are happening racially in America. Europeans, especially these French, don't understand it. They look at America as, they still hold America in a privileged place. They think America as Ronald Reagan's shining city on a hill. They are dismayed at what's going on in the streets. They are dismayed that after we elected a black president, we seem to have gone backwards instead of forwards. So a lot of the questions that I get as I run around the country talking about this book, talk about the racial situation in America. I always fall back on the fact that yes, there are racial problems in America, and part of that problematic is the groupthink. When we think like a group, we act like that group is supposed to act. But when we think as individuals, it's another story altogether. And that's what I'm trying to impart in that book and in this film, that when we meet people one-on-one, the situation is not nearly as dire as it looks when we're reading the newspaper. So to finish, let me just say that I think we should all stop watching television and not only canoe down the Mississippi River, which would be a great thing to do for everybody, but also get out and meet your neighbor. Get out of the house and meet somebody, talk to somebody. Even, especially perhaps, I was going to say even people with whom you do not agree, but maybe especially people you don't agree with. It's a way to feel the other, to feel empathy for the other, to understand the other, for him to understand you as well. And I think we go a long way toward making a better universe if we spend some time with each other.
Is this a point at which you'd like to be taking questions?
Oh, yes, please.
Thank you. For the rest of you, my name is Ann Lewis, and I wanted to give a little bit of background on Eddy. He jumped right in, which we're glad to have him do. We're very happy to have him do. But I did want to share with you the other books that he has written, which is Mississippi Solo, Native Stranger, South of Haunted Dreams, and Still Life in Harlem. And this has led his publisher to describe him as America's premier African-American memoirist and travel writer. And I wanted to, because he's in a unique position to be talking about the Mississippi River, and I suspect sitting beside the Seine, I wanted to ask him on behalf of someone else how he describes to people in France the Mississippi River and his trips. And how do you paint that picture for them? Because they are two very different rivers and they are two very different experiences of a river.
They are totally different rivers. I remember once, many, many years ago, I was walking along the Seine at flood season, because the Seine floods as well as the Mississippi does. And the person I was walking with commented on how remarkable the Seine's flooding was that particular day. To which I replied, not unlike Crocodile Dundee, that's not a flood. So there is no real comparison between the Mississippi River, how it functions, what it does, and what it means. There's no comparison between that river and any river in France. The longest river in France is the Loire. I could canoe the Loire River in 3 days. It's just an amazing, the scale is so amazingly different. It's hard to describe, partly because of the scale, but also because everybody in France has an image of the Mississippi River, has an image of Louisiana, which is not Louisiana. When I tell people I live in St. Louis, I grew up in St. Louis, their first response is, oh, that's in Louisiana, because they mix up or they conflate New Orleans and St. Louis and all of what used to be Nouvelle-France in the early part of the North American development. So they have no real notion except what they've gotten from movies, which is considerable, and what they get from Mark Twain. And I don't know a soul in France who's not read Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer, and or has seen some of the movies about those two books, or taken from those two books. So I try to describe this journey, and first of all, 4,000 kilometers, 2,500 miles is long. The Loire, I think, is maybe 600 kilometers. So they put my river in context with their longest river, and there is just no comparison whatsoever.
So you don't even try, huh?
Well, it's impossible to do it, partly because of the size and the mystique, and because they have a notion already of what they think the Mississippi River is. However erroneous that impression is, they already have a notion. What floors them is the 4,000 kilometers, 2,500 miles. It's just way too long for the French to grasp.
So in that case, it's size.
Yeah, size is important.
If people want to enter questions in the chat box, use tech support as the way that you do that. But I have a question from one of my co-commissioners in Minnesota. Did you encounter Native Americans along the river?
Of course. In fact, I went wild ricing with Jim Jones around Lake Bemidji, Lake Leach area. And we spent the day, or a morning anyway, he spent the morning ricing with his son-in-law. I was in my canoe just beside them watching, because I'm not allowed to, a non-native is not allowed to go harvesting for wild rice. And I went to a powwow just outside St. Paul. So yeah, I encountered lots of Native Americans, and in the film, or in the book, I'm writing about the second journey, because I'm in the process of doing that now. And in this book, I'm talking about conversations that I have that do not show up on film, about the relationship between the Indians and the river and nature itself, and how when Jim before he starts ricing, he gives an offering of tobacco to the Gitchimanidu, to the Great Spirit. And it's just a beautiful thing. And it's so beautiful because it's as if he's saying, I cannot take this rice without giving something back, however small the something is. It's a gratitude, it's a graciousness, it's a generosity in return for generosity, not unlike when two people meet and there's some resonance. I think that's what we need to figure out how to do, is the give and give of our relationships.
Thank you very much. Is there something that surprised you when you came down the river the second time that was starkly different from the first trip?
Not really. Well, I met John Anfinson, and that was pretty different and pretty cool, because he is a smart guy. He knows the river in ways that I don't. He can talk about the river in ways that I cannot. So that was fun, just me seeing him today, but also talking with him when I was canoeing down the river. The major difference is, the thing that slaps me upside the head most starkly, is the fact that when I finished the first journey, I told people that I was absolutely sure that I could canoe the river again in a year or 2 years, and I could find the same places I camped the first time. I could find this same tree. I'd find these same people. And now the river changes. And that, I think, is the starkest difference between Journey 1 and Journey 2. The river is not the same river. The river is changing constantly, and especially in the northern reaches of the river, where it is still small and it's making its way, finding its way, and it's a different animal altogether. But in terms of the people that I met, because the world is different, because the world is maybe in a darker place than it was in 1985. I'm not sure that's true. Let us assume that it is true that we were in a darker place right now. You would not know it from the people that I met and talked to and had encounters with. And again, I've got another example of a little old lady in a little hotel in Iowa. The hotel is closed, and I knock on her door. I just wanted a room that night. I can't remember it, but I knocked on her door. She opened the door. I had seen her in the kitchen. She was cooking dinner. She opened the door, and here's this big black man in front of this little bitty old white woman. And I said to her, first words out of my mouth, without thinking, "What's for dinner?" She did not miss a beat. She said, "I'm making soup." Before our little exchange on the front porch of her place was over, not only am I given a room and she's negotiating the price down by herself, I didn't say a thing, but she's negotiating the price down. I get a room, I get soup. She also brings me snacks. And the tagline of that episode is, big black man comes to your door in the middle of the night. What do? You offer him soup. And I think it's a beautiful moment. And it's one that we should all remember, especially when a woman in Detroit, I think, knocks on somebody's door after a car accident and gets shot at. And all of these other negative inputs that we get from watching the news, but from modern life, we don't see this little old white lady and her bucket of soup that she's passing out to me. And that's the America that I want to talk about. And that's the America that I know. And when I try to explain to people that I don't live my life with race as my constant companion, they don't understand those kind of encounters without the racial element. And the racial element is there because I am a big black man and she was a small white woman. And yet we found a way to have our give encounter.
Thanks for that. I have another question for you. You talked about Mark Twain's influence on how the French see the Mississippi, but how did he influence the way that you saw the Mississippi? And then before you took your first trip, and then how did it develop as you went along?
I'm not sure it developed, except that you cannot be on the Mississippi River, especially as a writer, without having Mark Twain hanging over your head like the sword of Damocles. Realize that Mark Twain is the reference point. And if you're going to write a book that, I'm not even going to say surpasses Mark Twain, but comes close to Mark Twain, you've got to be conscious of what Mark Twain did. Excuse me, as a younger person, of course, I read Life on the Mississippi, which I thought was fantastic. I read Tom Sawyer and I read Huckleberry Finn. Those are the three Mississippi River books that I guess marked me. But more than Life on the Mississippi and Tom Sawyer, it's the Huckleberry Finn book. And Huckleberry Finn's important to me because of Jim, not so much because of Huck. I'm fascinated by this person who is central to the story, and yet we don't really know him. And he becomes, as I'm traveling down the river, a kind of metaphor for this America that I don't really know. And it's not about race, it's not about color. It's about the hidden America that we just don't see. We don't know Jim. We don't really know America. We think we do because we're in it and we're seeing it every day. But we don't really get under the skin of the country or under the skin of Jim to talk to him or to the country to find out what this place really is and what it means.
I have another question, very different from that one. How could the river be better for canoers, or what advice would you give to people who want to canoe the whole river, or just a big portion of it?
First advice is get a big bottle of whiskey and go for it, or get a big bottle of whiskey and discourage yourself. It's a beautiful thing. It is not a difficult river. It is not a hard river to paddle. I'm convinced anybody can do it. If I can do it, anybody can do it. I had absolutely no canoeing experience before I took on the river. And I came out of the river feeling not just in love with the Mississippi River, but in love with that sort of physical activity. Being out in nature, camping every night, paddling all day long, being really, really tired. It's just, it's magnificent. It's a special, special feeling, and we don't feel it that often in our modern day existences. But the only advice is to do it. How could you make it better? The DNR up in Minnesota has already made that part of the river better because they've carved out a whole pile of places only for canoers and kayakers who can camp in particular places. It's just amazing what the Minnesota DNR has done. So if there's a desire in my heart, it is that other natural resource departments do the same sort of things and encourage people to get out in a canoe and paddle. There's plenty of, on the upper river anyway, there are plenty of places for motorboaters. There are a lot of resources for people with motors. There are a lot of marinas, but there aren't that many places specifically for guys in canoes, for people in canoes. And I think that's important. That is a resource that we need to develop more, just to have places for people to pull out easily and pitch a tent.
Thank you, and thanks for that shout out to the Minnesota DNR. They're a partner of our commission, and we really appreciate the work that they've done, but it's good to have that shout out. Another question came in about the Driftless Area. I don't know if you recall the Driftless Area that you went through,
sure.
But how do you explain that area and the existence of refuges, wildlife refuges along that area? And is that something that can capture the imagination of Europeans?
The driftless area, the area itself, especially the word driftless, probably does capture Europeans. I don't know how to explain it except in geological terms, and I'm not a geologist, and we can talk about glaciers, but I'm sure there are better people to talk about the glaciification of Wisconsin than I. Yeah, it's not in my wheelhouse, I'm afraid. But the Europeans certainly would be interested in it just because it's nature. Europeans seem to have a deeper engagement with the natural world than Americans do, or at least the Americans that I know. And I don't know why that is, but my speculation is there are very few places in Europe that look like the 17th or 18th century. Everything in Europe has been touched. But when they think of America, they think of pristine forests, and I'm not sure how realistic their viewpoints are. But they think of pristine forests, they think of wide open spaces. They've got the deserts in the Southwest in their minds, which are just vast tracts of nothing. And part of that is true. And part of it is because we are a big country, and because we are, for the size of the country, a relatively small population, and that small population is grouped primarily in cities and primarily in the east of the country. And so when they think of the great west of America, they're in John Ford, John Wayne Movieville. And it brings them to a sense of nature that they don't necessarily get in Europe. At the same time, the Europeans that I know spend a lot of time hiking and camping and just being in nature a lot more than most Americans do.
That's a very interesting observation. Along the canoeing question, someone here has asked, and I've met him too. Did you run across John Ruskey of the Quapaw Canoers when you were on your trip?
I know John. John and I are like brothers. I mean, we are soulmates.
Great,
Yes,
good.
I
have a question in the chat from a former teacher of French at your alma mater at St. Louis Priory School. And would you please tell the audience, if you would, what led you to France? She's a French teacher, remember that. And she'd like to know what led you to go to France.
Well, before she signed on to Priory, back in my day when I was a young 7th grader in that place, there was a French teacher whose name was Edward Cook. Edward Cook was a very special kind of person. He was very exuberant. He was very disciplinarianly rigid. He came to class right on time, never before, never after the bell, but right as the bell was ringing. And he spoke an impeccable French. There was something about having him as a 12-year-old student that imparted into me in ways that other students in that same class, that imparted to me that those other kids did not get, a love for the language. It is the love for that language that brought me ultimately to France. So 6 years of French, a initial between high school and university backpacking trip brought me to France the first time. And a lot of French movies that the French teachers made us watch, but old French movies, not modern French movies. But there was old, probably they're old now, but they probably weren't that old then. But François Truffaut and films of Paris when Paris was still really Paris. And I just fell in love. I fell in love with the place and thought, wow, this is pretty cool. So at 18 years old, I went for the first time, and I just kept coming back, and finally I knew this was the place for me.
That's a great, there is a great shout out for teachers everywhere.
Well, every, I don't know if ever, I can't say every. So many of us are touched by a particular teacher in one thing or another, in one way or another. And I was probably more touched by Mr. Cook than by any other teacher I had in my entire grade school, high school, university career. And part of that comes from the language, his love for language, and my love for languages now, and the way he talked about France and the way he really drilled us in this learning process. Before I went to that school, I had no exposure to foreign languages. It was this guy. He was just so strange that he was bigger than life for most of us, even though the other kids did not get the same love for French and or France that I got. Everybody still talks about, everybody in my class still talks about Mr. Cook.
Great. Well, let's move on to a question from someone who wants to know about your process of writing. Would you say that Mississippi Solo is more a collection of immediate impressions or a product of careful reflection? And how has the act of writing transformed your relationship to the Mississippi?
That is great, because the reflection took place on the river. I don't know, before I wrote this book, I thought I was going to be a fiction writer. I was writing love stories, I was writing detective stories, I was writing spy stories. I wanted to be a writer who made money. It did not work out. So I took this trip in order to see who I really was. It turns out that I'm a nonfiction writer who writes reflectively. The feelings I wrote come from the feelings I felt on the river during that journey. The physical activity of canoeing, meeting people, talking to people, I discovered this. All I had to do was write what happened. I didn't have to do a whole lot of manipulation of events to make the story. The story is right there in the river. But what happened was, what happens is you're in the middle of something. You don't really know what you're doing. It's almost like being an inventive chef. You're in the kitchen, and you've got all these things, and you're just throwing stuff together, but you don't know what it is until you sit down to eat it. I didn't really know what the trip was until I started to write the book. Writing the book illuminated the journey for me. It made the journey real. I got to relive the journey, but I got to relive it in a more internal way than the physical activity would have allowed. So it isn't just about the writing, It's about feeling what I felt and trying to get in touch with those moments on the river when my thoughts were soaring into the trees and following eagles and herons down the river, and just trying to capture that as honestly as I possibly could.
So is this something you would recommend to others who come in contact with a long, prolonged period of time with the river, is to write about it and then reflect on it?
Reflect on it first and then write about it.
Wow.
And then reflect on it while writing about it. Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So I have a question for you also that I'd be interested to know if you, the difference for you physically between your first trip and your second trip, which you did when you were how old?
29, the first one.
29, the first one, and the second one?
60.
60. So physically, how did that change your impression of the river?
I don't know if it changed my impression of the river, but it certainly changed my impression of me. When I went down the river the first time, I was a young man and an athlete, or a former athlete, and I had muscles still. When I went down the second time, now I'm an old guy, and it's a lot harder. It's not just harder. Well, it's harder in many ways. Part of it's physical. Part of it is the mental aspect of not being able, of not knowing how, I don't know how to explain this. The physical problems are physical. Yes, my knees hurt now, even now, 4 years after I did that journey, in ways that they did not hurt 4 years after the first journey. During the first journey, because I was really just paddling along, I was sore a lot, but not in the same way. The second journey, the soreness lingered. Because I am older, it's as physical, if not more physical, than the first time because I am older. And so it's just harder. At the same time, when you're young, when you're a young failed writer, finding time to paddle down the Mississippi River is not a problem. When you're a less failed writer, or even a successful writer, or somebody in a real job, finding 4 months to go down the Mississippi River is not easy. So part of the difficulty of the second journey was just finding the time to be able to do it, to unplug myself from the life I had constructed, to be able to do this other thing. Luckily, I do this sort of thing a lot. I have a lot of experience of plugging myself out, unplugging myself rather. The real difficulty is when you're trying to come back and plug yourself back in to the hole that you left when you took off. And that was harder. And the first time, there's no hole, nobody's looking for me, nobody's asking for my time. The second time, I'm in demand a lot more than I was the first time. And for me to say I'm taking off to go paddle down the Mississippi River, it means that there are a lot of other things that I won't be able to do. But my back still hurts.
I understand. And paddling is really rigorous. And we have one gentleman on today who also biked all the way from Lake Itasca to New Orleans. So he sends you his admiration. Did you come across cyclists, he asks, on your trips? And did you compare perspectives?
I didn't run across any cyclists who were cycling at the time. I did run across a cyclist who had abandoned his cycle somewhere in Iowa. He was on a religious mission. He was canoeing from west coast to east coast, bicycling from west coast to east coast. And when he got to the Mississippi River, he heard the call to go down the river. So he took his bicycle apart, got himself a rowboat, affixed the cycling mechanism to this rowboat, and made a little paddle boat out of his bicycle and this rowboat he had found. And then he's just paddling, cycling down the river. And I ran into him I had heard about him already, but I ran into him when we got to Natchez, Mississippi. And we had a long conversation about the call that he had and about his experiences on the river. but no cyclists who had just cycled down the Mississippi River.
We have about 5 minutes left, and there may be more questions, so put them in the chat if you'd like to. But I wonder if you might talk about the movie River to the Heart, how you as a writer approached or got to the point where you thought a movie was the right vehicle for you, and where that stands today, and some of the where people might be able to find it.
I'm afraid they can't find it anywhere except in my living room right now. I'm looking for distribution, and that is the hardest part of making a small documentary. But the idea was to do the second journey down the Mississippi River. And I knew, because I'm a writer, I wanted to do something with the journey, not just me and my canoe and going down the river. Since I had already written a book, I thought the next logical vehicle would be to make a documentary film. To me, it's the same sort of mechanism, except that you're doing it with other people instead of just alone, which of course changes the journey, changes a lot that happens in the journey as well, which then leads to the next project that I've been working on since then, which is the book that talks about the parts of the journey when the film crew wasn't there. The journey was so remarkable to me that the filming of it was great, and the movie is beautiful. I have to say, I get criticized for my lack of humility about this movie all the time, but the movie is really beautiful, and it tells an essential story for our political time. It's just beautiful. The story of the woman in that hotel, the story of the guy. No, the story of the guy is not in the movie because nobody was around when that was happening. But the message of this movie is what I've been trying to impart, in that we need to know each other. And it's a beautiful movie, but it's a little too quiet. I didn't die in the movie. I didn't have any major problems in the movie. And so there's no drama, there's no tension, except it's just really beautiful. But the reason I wanted to make that movie was to capture the physical splendor of the river and the areas around the river that I perhaps am not capable of capturing with my pen and paper. I managed to capture Lake Itasca, I think, in the first book. And one of the things I said about it was, this is one of the most beautiful places I have ever seen. But you can't say that every 15 pages as you're writing a book, but you can show it in a movie. You can just show that kind of splendor, and that's what we were trying to do.
Well, I can appreciate, having been to Lake Itasca numerous times, I can appreciate that splendor, and we'll look forward to getting that distributed. I also wanted to let people know who are on with us today that we're going to, after this session finishes, we will post the number or the names of the books and where they might be able to be purchased that we've referenced, that you've been referencing. I have I have another question. Based on your travels on the Mississippi, what would you advise riverfront communities, and we've got a lot of people representing a lot of different riverfront communities on this call, is the most needed amenity that they should provide for river travelers?
I don't know. The problem with riverfront amenities is the flooding of that river. Especially when you get below St. Louis, it just goes nuts. I've often wondered why St. Louis doesn't have a well-developed riverfront, and part of the problem is it just gets covered by water twice a year. More restaurants, probably. A river walk, just some place where you can get close to the river and walk along it. The way people in Paris do with the Seine, the way people in Vienna do with the Danube, just somehow to access it. And some green spaces where you can lie on the grass and have a picnic and just be near the river.
And I think a lot of our communities are doing that and there are now more ways to plan those so that they can be resilient to flooding. So we have things going for us now that maybe weren't there several years ago. go ahead.
It's a beautiful river, and we should all not only participate, but we should take advantage of it. We should understand just how wonderful a resource it is for us.
We're about ready to wrap up here. I want to thank you for your time today, especially under the circumstances with pop-up dental problems. You've been a terrific speaker, and it's been really wonderful to hear your love of the river and to hear your admiration for this, and also to hear your storytelling approaches. It's really been a wonderful thing to have you be with us all the way from Paris. One person asked if there was a way to get in touch with you, and I'm going to just say that you can, if you wish to share that with Suzanne, and she will make that available on the landing page for this event. But I want to again thank you very much for your time, for your preparation, for the work that you're doing. The video I will attest to, it was in the first part that we rolled. It's so pretty, it's so beautiful, and perhaps there's someone on here who has some tips that they can share about movie distribution. And in any case, please be well, be safe in Paris, be safe in this time, and we thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.